Hey, Sergeant Mop missed a spot, old man, that's what they called him, day after day, an invisible man in a gray janitor's uniform, pushing a cart through marble halls where arrogance echoed louder than respect. Will one man's quiet dignity change everything? No one asked his name, no one cared about the limp in his step or the stories behind that faded retired cap, until the day a four-star general walked in and stopped the entire academy with a single salute, because sometimes the quietest man in the room has lived the loudest life. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun bled pale light across the stone walls of Westbridge Military Training Academy. Out here, 50 miles from anything resembling a real town, the academy stood like a monument to forgotten values. Tradition still echoed in the marble floors, in the crisp lines of the cadet uniforms, but somewhere along the way humility had been left behind. Inside those polished halls, the air was thick with the weight of expectation. Sons of generals, daughters of admirals, recruits fresh from spotless suburban homes, marching like they had already earned their place in history, and weaving between them, unnoticed by most, was a man pushing a janitor. Elias roared, no rank stitched to his sleeve, no nameplate gleaming from his chest, just a battered gray custodial uniform, a faded ball cap with the word retired arched above an insignia no one cared to read. Every morning before the first cadet had even rubbed the sleep from their eyes, Elias was already there, sweeping, scrubbing, mopping up their boot prints like it was his burden to carry. He moved slow, deliberate. The limp in his right leg was permanent now, but it didn't stop him. It never had. To cadets, he was invisible to most of them anyway. From his post by the south corridor, Sergeant Andrew Blake watched, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, taking it all in with the patience of a man who'd seen worse. Iraq had taught him that much. Blake wasn't impressed with Westbridge's new generation. They walked the halls like conquerors, barking orders, correcting each other's salutes like they had already earned the right, but none of them noticed the man who cleaned up after them. None of them asked why he paused every morning before the wall of honor. Blake noticed. He noticed how Elias's fingers lingered on the photo of a young officer caught in a sandstorm, saluting with a quiet defiance that didn't need applause. He noticed how the old man's eyes darkened, not with regret, but with a kind of remembrance that words couldn't carry. But cadets like Landon Myers didn't notice, or maybe they didn't care. Second year, full of swagger, all charm and bravado, he strutted through the halls, flanked by his pack of imitators, the way hyenas circle a kill. Morning, Sergeant Mop, Landon would call out, voice loud enough to echo off the high ceilings. Don't suppose you missed a spot back there, did you? His friends would snicker, glancing sideways to see who else was watching. Elias never answered. He'd pause, push his broom a little slower, and keep moving, but that silence, they mistook it for shame. Andrew Blake knew better. He remembered men like Elias and men who didn't need to boast, men who carried their weight quietly until the moment came to bear it for others. Still, day after day, Blake stayed leaning on that wall, watching, waiting. Part of him wondered when, if the tide would turn, if these cadets would ever understand the difference between wearing a uniform and honoring it. What secret was Elias hiding? That morning, as sunlight filtered through the stained glass crest above the academy's main hall, the daily rituals played out as they always did. Cadets filed in, boots polished, voices sharp, but their eyes glazed with routine. And there was Elias, same uniform, same cart, same slow shuffle. Blake caught the moment Landon spotted him. Hey, Sergeant Mop, Landon drawled, swaggering closer, got a real important mission for you today. Think you can handle it? He kicked a paper cup off the floor, sending it skittering toward Elias's feet. More snickers. Elias bent down, picked up the cup, and placed it in his cart without a word. Blake's jaw tightened, his fingers drummed against his forearm, the old battle reflex itching to step in, but he didn't. Not yet, because Elias' roar didn't need defending, not from this, and deep down Blake suspected the cadets were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The truth was Westbridge had forgotten what real leadership looked like. They had their parades, their plaques, their hollow speeches about duty and sacrifice, but they'd lost sight of the men who built those words from blood and grit. Men like Elias. As the cadets filed out, Blake pushed off the wall and approached. Morning, Mr. Roar, he said, voice low but firm. Elias glanced up, offered a faint nod. Blake lowered his voice, stepping closer. You ever get tired of letting them mouth off like that? Elias's lips twitched, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. They're still learning, he said simply. Some lessons don't come easy. Blake huffed a quiet laugh. Nope, they don't. They stood in silence for a moment, two soldiers from different wars, different generations, bound by the same understanding. Elias resumed pushing his cart. Blake watched him go. As he did every morning, Elias paused before the wall of honor, his hand rose, fingers brushing lightly over the photo of the young officer in the storm. Blake had seen that photo 100 times, but only now did he notice the name beneath it, Commander Elias Roar. His throat tightened. He looked back at the old man, still standing there alone in a hall full of noise, and in that moment Blake knew the academy hadn't just overlooked Elias, they had forgotten their own foundation, but not for much longer, not if fate had its way, and Blake had a feeling it was about to. What would happen when the truth came out? The next week passed in a steady rhythm of arrogance. Cadets paraded through Westbridge's grand halls, their footsteps loud, their voices louder. For them, the academy was a stage, every glance was a performance, every salute a photo opportunity. They were rehearsing greatness without ever understanding the weight of it, and as always Elias Rohr was there, quiet, steady, pushing his cart down corridors where his name had once echoed for far different reasons. Sergeant Andrew Blake watched from his usual spot, leaning on the south corridor railing, arms crossed, coffee cooling in his hand. He wasn't fooled by the show. Underneath the pressed uniforms and rehearsed salutes, Blake saw the cracks: ego without experience, confidence without consequence, and he knew what was coming. It came faster than he'd expected. The annual symposium was a week away, a prestigious event that brought generals, dignitaries, and a flood of media attention. The cadets felt it. The tension, the need to impress, and with it came a familiar cruelty, picking apart those deemed beneath them. That morning the cafeteria buzzed louder than usual. The long steel tables gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, trays clattered, laughter ricocheted off tile walls. Elias moved among them, mop in hand, collecting the remnants of other people's days. His steps were slow but not hesitant, his posture straight, though the years had done their best to bend him. Landon Meyer spotted him first. The second-year cadet was holding court at the center table, flanked by his usual entourage. His smirk widened as Elias passed with exaggerated care. Landon stood balancing a tray laden with scrambled eggs, toast, and a full glass of orange juice, and then, in a motion so deliberate it silenced the nearby tables, he tripped. The tray crashed to the ground, eggs splattered across polished boots, toast skidded under chairs, the orange juice pooled in a slow, sticky flood across the tile. "Oops," Landon said, voice bright with mockery, "looks like we got ourselves a battlefield." Sergeant Mop. A ripple of laughter rolled through the cafeteria, but Elias didn't flinch, not even a blink. He simply bent down, retrieved the tray, and began to clean. He slowed, methodical, as if the room weren't full of eyes waiting for him to react. That only emboldened them. A napkin fluttered to the floor beside him, then another, then a deliberate spill of coffee. One cadet even dropped a banana peel like they were in a cartoon skit, grinning as it landed inches from Elias's hand. Still, Elias continued. His movements were careful, precise, no wasted energy, no wasted emotion. To him, this wasn't humiliation, it was work. Andrew Blake's jaw clenched. He wasn't surprised by Landon. Every academy had its golden boy, polished on the outside, hollow within. But what gnawed Blake now wasn't Landon's cruelty, it was the silence of the others. Not one cadet spoke up, not one instructor intervened. Blake could hear the faint scratch of his father's voice in his memory, back in Mosul, back when leaders were measured by the men they stood beside. Respect doesn't trickle down, son, it radiates outward from action. And right now, Westbridge was failing that lesson. Blake's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He wanted to step in, to call them out, to remind these kids what it meant to wear that uniform, but regulations held him in place. He was a training sergeant, his role was discipline, not lecture, and the academy, so obsessed with appearances, preferred their messes handled quietly. Elias wasn't making a scene, but Blake's restraint was wearing thin. He watched as Elias finished mopping the last streak of orange juice, rising slowly. The old man adjusted his cap, tucking a loose strand of silver hair beneath the brim. For a heartbeat, Blake hoped Elias might say something, but as always, he didn't. He simply pushed his cart forward, and then, as if by instinct, Elias paused, right there between the cafeteria doors where the wall of honor stood. A series of framed photographs lined the marble wall. Commanders, heroes, faces immortalized in black and white. Most cadets passed by without a glance, too focused on their rare reflections in their polished boots. But Elias stopped. Blake knew the routine by now. Every morning, every afternoon, without fail. Yet today, standing there, soaked in the residue of fresh humiliation, Elias lingered longer. His hand rose, steady despite the tremor in his fingers, and rested on one particular frame. Blake's eyes narrowed. It was a photograph he'd seen a dozen times. A young officer in desert fatigues, face partially obscured by a sandstorm, caught mid-salute. The edges of the image were blurred, windswept, but the posture was unmistakable, proud, unyielding. Underneath, a brass plate gleamed. Commander Elias Rohr, Operation Goliath. Blake's breath caught. He'd read the name before, but now it clicked. Sergeant Mop, the janitor, Commander Rohr. His grip on the coffee cup loosened as the weight of it settled. They didn't know, the cadets, the instructors, they had no idea who Elias really was, but Blake did now. A wave of memories washed over him, of briefing rooms where whispers of Operation Goliath circulated like myth, of veterans who spoke of a commander who led from the front, who pulled men from burning wrecks, who bled alongside his unit without ever asking for recognition. And here he was, pushing a mop at Westbridge. Blake's throat tightened. The academy had built itself on men like Elias, and now it let their legacy be mocked by children playing soldier. Blake felt the tension coil in his chest. There was a storm coming, he could feel it, but today wasn't the day to break rank. Today was the day to watch, to witness, because some battles aren't fought with words, some are fought by standing your ground until the world is forced to see you. Elias Rohr wasn't just standing, he was teaching, one step, one sweep, one act of silent defiance at a time, and Blake knew with certainty that reckoning was close. Landon and his friends didn't realize it yet, but they were about to. Learn a lesson no classroom could teach. Blake's gaze followed Elias as he disappeared down the corridor. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day of the symposium arrived with military precision. Westbridge Academy gleamed under the sharp morning sun, every window polished, every flag starched and snapping in the breeze. Cadets stood taller, their salutes hit sharper. Even Landon Myers adjusted his tie twice before stepping into the Grand Assembly Hall. Today, they were expecting greatness. General Marcus Denning was in town. The name alone straightened spines. Denning was a legend. For stars on his shoulder, but more importantly, a reputation carved from fire and grit. He had led missions across continents, mentored officers who would shape the next generation. His presence wasn't just an honor, it was a measuring stick. For once, even Landon's swagger dimmed. The assembly hall buzzed with a nervous energy. Rows upon rows of cadets filled the seats, their shoes gleaming, their eyes fixed ahead. Instructors lined the walls, clipboards in hand, trying to look indifferent. Cameras perched discreetly on tripods. This was Westbridge's showcase moment. Sergeant Andrew Blake stood at the back, arms folded, watching it all with a weight in his chest. But he wasn't watching Denning's empty podium, he was watching the side corridor, because he knew who else was here. Elias Rohr, same gray uniform, same cart, same steady shuffle. But this morning Blake noticed something different. The way Elias paused just outside the hall, adjusting his cap, his gaze lingering not on the marble floors, but on the stage itself. He wasn't here by accident. Blake's gut told him as much. Then, with the sudden hush of a command unspoken, the double doors opened. General Denning entered. The air seemed to thicken and conversations cut mid-sentence. Cadets snapped to attention, salutes crisp, eyes front. Denning's presence filled the space. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, but his expression carved from stone. This was a man who had seen more than he'd ever tell, and carried it in the weight of his stride. But then something unexpected happened. Denning didn't head for the podium. He didn't acknowledge the brass lined up in the front row. Instead, his gaze locked onto the figure standing quietly by the side corridor, Elias Rohr, and without a word, Denning changed course. His boots echoed with purpose as he crossed the assembly hall, not towards the stage, but towards the janitor. The cadets turned one by one, necks craning, whispers rising like a tide. What is he doing? Who's that? Why is he? Landon Myers watched, confusion sharpening into discomfort. Denning stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Elias. The hall held its breath. Then, with the crispness of a man who had rendered this motion thousands of times, Denning raised his hand and saluted, a full formal military salute to the janitor. The silence cracked, not a cough, not a shuffle, just the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Sir, Denning said, his voice steady, resonant, carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. It's an honor to finally meet you in person. The words rippled through the air like a detonation. Sir, he called him sir. For the first time anyone could remember, Elias Rohr returned the salute. No flourish, no theatrics, just the quiet precision of a man who had once taught others what respect truly meant. Denning turned slowly, addressing the room. Before I begin my speech, I want to recognize someone far more important than myself, someone whose leadership, courage, and sacrifice saved lives, not stories, not reputations, lives. He paused, letting the weight settle. Commander Elias Rohr. The name hit like a thunderclap. Mouths opened, cadets froze. Landon's smirk died on his lips. Denning continued, most of you don't know the name. That's not surprising. His missions were never meant for headlines. Operation Goliath, a name whispered in briefings, never spoken aloud until today. Blake's heart pounded. I was a lieutenant back then, Denning said, green, overconfident, sure I had the world figured out. Then my unit walked into hell, ambushed, pinned down. No air support, no extraction. He turned to Elias, his voice roughening, and then he came. Commander Rohr led a unit so deep into enemy territory, even the maps gave up. He pulled us out, carried 2 wounded men on his back, gave us a fighting chance. He didn't do it for glory, he did it because it was right. The cadets sat frozen. This man, Denning gestured, is why I'm standing here today. The hall felt too small for the truth filling it. Denning faced Elias again. I owe you my life, sir. And these cadets owe you their respect. Elias didn't move at first, but then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I'll speak, not for me, for the ones who never made it home. Blake felt his throat tighten. The assembly hall, once buzzing with restless energy, now held a different silence, a reverent silence. Elias stepped forward. His limp was there, but so was his strength. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point fingers, he simply spoke. I've seen young men break under pressure, not for lack of strength, but for lack of humility. His gaze swept the room. Cadets who had laughed at him days ago now sat motionless. I didn't come back from war to be thanked, I came back to stay close to what I loved, to remember those who can't. The words cut deeper than any reprimand. No plaque bears my name, no wing of this academy tells our story, but that's not why we served. He let the silence breathe. Respect isn't given by rank, it's earned by how you stand when no one's watching. Blake saw the shift. Cadets who had once nudged each other now sat straighter. Landon Myers' face was Pale, his bravado drained, Elias continued, "You wear this uniform to protect more than your pride, you wear it to carry a legacy built by those whose names you'll never know." The hall seemed to pulse with every word. When he finished, Elias didn't bow, didn't step back seeking applause, he simply stood there, and one by one, the cadets rose, no cheers, no clapping, just a silent salute, 200 future officers standing in honor of a man they had once dismissed. Blake stood with them, his salute was sharp, firm, not just as a sergeant, but as a man paying a debt long overdue, and in that moment, the academy remembered who it was built for, not the loudest voices, but the quietest legacies. Elias Rohr nodded once, then, as always, he pushed his cart forward, but this time, he didn't walk alone. The silence inside Westbridge's grand hall was profound. 200 cadets stood at attention, rows of stiff collars, gleaming boots, and eyes that no longer looked past the old man in gray. Elias Rohr, the janitor, the commander. He hadn't asked for their respect, but in this moment, he had earned it back. Elias let the stillness breathe before he spoke again. His voice was even, but every word carried the weight of memory. "Leadership," he said quietly, "isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, it's about standing steady when others can't, about making choices no one will ever thank you for." His eyes moved across the sea of cadets. They didn't look away. It's easy to salute when the cameras are rolling, easy to stand tall when medals shine on your chest, but true service, his words slowed, deliberate, true service is often invisible. It happens in the dirt, in the dark, when there's no audience, no applause in the back. Sergeant Andrew Blake felt his throat tighten. This wasn't a lecture, it was a reckoning. Elias continued, his voice a calm undercurrent. "War teaches you many things about courage, about loss, but the cruelest lesson it gives is how easily people forget. When the mission ends, when the uniforms are hung, the world moves on." He paused, "and sometimes it forgets those who gave it the right to move on." Landon Meyer stood frozen in the front row, his hands, once so eager to mock, now clenched at his sides, his jaw was tight, his face pale. Blake saw the moment the words pierced through. Elias didn't linger on him. He didn't need to. "This academy stands because of sacrifice, not just mine, not just the faces on that wall, but thousands you'll never know. They don't ask for gratitude, but they deserve your respect." He let the silence settle again. It was heavier now, not awkward, sacred. Blake's eyes scanned the room. Cadets who had once snickered behind their hands now stood rigid, their gazes straight, their pride tempered by truth, and then movement. Slow at first. Landon Myers, the same cadet who had spilled his tray to humiliate Elias, now stepped forward 1 pace, 2. He halted in front of the commander, his shoulders square, but his head slightly bowed, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. With a sharp, deliberate motion, Landon raised his hand, a perfect salute, no smirk, no bravado. "Sir," he said, voice clear, but lined with shame, "I apologize, my actions were disrespectful, I didn't know who you were, but ignorance is no excuse." His hand dropped slowly. "I'm sorry." Elias didn't smile, he didn't need to. He simply nodded once, a quiet acceptance, a forgiveness born not from obligation, but from understanding. Behind Landon, another cadet stepped forward, then another. One by one, they saluted, not for a photo, not for recognition, but for the man who had stood quietly among them all this time. Blake felt his chest tighten as he stood tall in the balcony. His hand rose in a crisp salute, for Elias. For every man who had ever carried the weight of leadership without needing a stage. Elias Rohr turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the hall one last time. No words, no fanfare, just a man who had said what needed saying. Slowly, he placed his hand on the handle of his janitor's cart, and with the same quiet dignity that had defined his every step, Elias began to walk down the aisle, past the cadets who now parted for him, not as obstacles, but as an honor guard. This time, no one looked through him, no one snickered, every pair of eyes followed. The commander was leaving the room, and he left it changed. Blake watched him until the gray figure faded into the light beyond the doorway. Then, with a deep breath, Blake lowered his salute. A strange peace settled over him. He knew this moment would never make the evening news. There would be no press release, no commemorative plaque hung by the dean's office, but it didn't need to today. Westbridge had been taught a lesson no textbook could offer, not by rank, not by title, but by a man with a mop, who had lived more leadership than most would ever grasp. As the hall slowly emptied, Blake remained in place, his voice, low but steady, echoed to himself more than anyone else. "Respect isn't about a uniform, it's not about medals, it's about the way you treat those who carried your burdens before you even knew you had them." He straightened his cap, and for the first time in years, Blake felt proud of this place again, not because of its name, but because today they had remembered what it stood for. Far down the corridor, the faint sound of wheels echoed, the soft rumble of Elias's cart rolling across polished floors, but in Blake's mind, it sounded a lot like a victory march, a quiet one, the kind that mattered, the kind that lasted. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.